month's bonus audio, available only at discovertheword.org, is an intriguingly unique sermon by Haddon Robinson that's in the form of a parable. So it's not a story about an actual church and their methods and real-life people in that church. But like Jesus' parables, it will make you think and leave you with questions to answer. Now, Haddon's parable is about the Church of God in Christ chicken restaurant. And Haddon wants to stress that although there is a Church of God in Christ denomination, it's certainly not meant to reflect on them. This is a parable about all of us that will make you think. Here's Haddon Robinson.
As the road snakes up into the mountains, it takes a strong turn to the left. Up on the right, there's a very successful restaurant that has a very strange name. It's called the Church of God in Christ Chicken Restaurant. It's a successful restaurant. You get there on a Sunday or even a Wednesday evening, and it's not unusual to have to wait for 45 minutes to an hour to be served. They give you one of those little beepers, and you're able to walk around the grounds. And there's a great deal to see. For example, back off the left of the eating area, there's a church. It's called the Church in the Wildwood. You enter the church, and by the use of electronic sound, you can hear a congregation at the turn of the century singing some of the old hymns. Amazing Grace, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? And then, as you would expect, come to the church in the wildwood, come to the church in the dale. No place is so warm in my childhood as that little brown church in the Vale. And then, following the music, there's the voice of a country preacher exhorting the people to godliness and explaining to them the gospel. You leave the church in the wildwood and go about 30 yards more to your left, and you'll see a large corrugated metal building. It's about 120 feet long, maybe 65 feet wide. When you go inside, it's a theater. And on the front, there's a huge portrait of the crucifixion of Jesus. Every 20 minutes, there's a kind of sound and light show. The light picks out different people who stood beneath the cross, and the narrator tells you what the cross meant in the eyes of those people. And in the course of it all, the narrator gives a very simple presentation of the basic message of Christianity. If you leave that portrait of the crucifixion and go maybe 50 yards more over to the other end of the area, you'll find a playground. It's called the New Jerusalem. It's really the old Jerusalem. What they did was they made a large playground out of the Jerusalem of the first century. So when the children play, they can get a lot of geography, learn it on the side, and play at Pilate's Hall or up at Herod's palace. I mean, it's just an interesting kind of visual aid. And then off on another part of the grounds, if you don't feel like walking, there's a garden of meditation. In the summer, there's cool breeze that blows through. In the winter, some warm breeze comes through. Quiet music. Chance to think, to meditate. Several years ago, my daughter Vicki and I were down in Buena Vista, down at the Deer Valley Ranch. And we were coming back to Denver. And we passed the Church of God in Christ Chicken Restaurant. And Vicki was curious about it, and so we stopped in to see what it was like. The mealtime was pretty much over, and we found a seat right away, and we were waited on by a very lovely waitress. She had a plain face, a bun in her hair, a little short for her weight, but she had a smile that, just a lovely smile. And so we felt free to ask her about the Church of God in Christ Chicken Restaurant. And how did you get that name? She told us a few years before that there'd been a church there that was small. They had maybe 55 people, and then if you counted the children in the cradle roll, you could get up to maybe 75 or 80. She said that the thing that made that church special was that they had a preacher, a Reverend Getz, and so she put it, he was a Bible man. She also said they had good fellowship. And one of the ways that they inspired the fellowship was that every time there was a fifth Sunday in a month, they would have dinner on the grounds. I gather this wasn't just, ordinary potluck. This was really something special. In fact, it was so special that on those Sundays they had dinner on the grounds. They would almost double their attendance. Not unusual to have 125, 130 people come. Well, the elder in charge of evangelism and outreach knew a good thing when he saw it. And so he said if it worked once every quarter, maybe it would work once every month. And he suggested that every fourth Sunday in the month they would have the dinner on the grounds. Folks agreed, and he was right. I mean, the attendance shot up, and on those Sundays it would be 140 people, and it went over to the other Sundays. The attendance just generally rose. Well, after a while, the elder in charge of outreach and evangelism and the other elders, figured it would work once a month, maybe it'd work every week. And so they brought that suggestion to the church that they would have dinner on the grounds every week as a way of reaching out to the people. The women in the church, who usually voted in a block, voted against that. It was one thing to have dinner on the grounds every month, but every week to get the kids ready and food ready was just a bit more than they wanted to handle. So the elders went back and thought about it again. And they came back with a truly visionary plan. That is, instead of having ordinary dinner on the grounds, what they would do is have the church supply the food. And then they would have some of the ladies in the church cook it. And then, they'd have a free will offering basket so people could help meet the expense. Folks responded well to that, and there were women in the church that could cook. There was Carrie Campbell. Carrie made chicken from a recipe that she had gotten from her father, who was a cook back in New York City. And he'd gotten it from a great aunt before him. I mean, it was good chicken. It made Colonel Sanders look like a buck private. And then there was Jenny Harrison. Jenny Harrison made biscuits. I mean, we're talking biscuits. From what I gathered, they were so light, they would just float off the plate if there weren't some of Jenny's raspberry jam and preserves to hold them down and keep them stuck. And then there was Margaret Gibson. She made desserts. She didn't really make desserts, she created desserts. And one of her favorites was a pecan pie. You folks who have been trapped in New England all your life really don't know much about pecan pie, but down in the South, it's a kind of a fine art. And if there is a platonic ideal of a pecan pie, Margaret Gibson got very close to it. And those ladies, since they had the gift of cooking, decided that this was their ministry, and they got to it, and it worked. I mean, the attendance went up, and folks came. It squeezed the service a little bit. Reverend Getz, who was used to preaching for 45 minutes, was asked to cut it to about 20 minutes, because after all, the ladies had to get up and get the food ready, and the men had to get all the tables prepared. But it kept growing. They got to 250 to 300, one of the largest churches in their denomination. One of the elders, who is a businessman, he ran a general store a couple of towns away, knew they needed help. And so he went into Denver and got a firm that made business plans and asked them to come out and take a look at the operation. They came out, and I guess it was a pro bono offer for them, but they came, they looked. And after a couple of Sundays, they realized what was going on. As one of them said, you got to dance with the boy who brought you. That's not the way the people in the Church of God in Christ would have said it, but they got the idea. You got to build on your strengths. I mean, go with what your strengths are. And they had three basic suggestions. One suggestion was that they needed more land. I mean, people had begun to come to this chicken restaurant from other churches in the community. I mean, they would go to their own church, and then they would come there to eat. Since they could put money in the offering plate, they didn't feel like they were mooching off the church. And so it was not unusual for them to have 500, 600 people. And as they pointed out, a lot of those folks wouldn't stay because they didn't have a place to park. So they bought 10 acres of land next to the church. There was a man who'd come to the church occasionally, gave him a good price on it. And then the second thing they suggested was that they needed a new building. The old building just didn't work. They were setting up tables on the outside, and the heat of the summer that didn't work very well, and the cold of the winter wasn't any good. They needed an all-purpose building, they said, really a building that would work for the chicken restaurant, and then they would have other things besides. That was a real stretch, but they took a step of faith, and they began to build the building, borrowed some money. And then as the building got built, a woman in the church, Bessie Burke, died. And she left the church $4.5 million. She had been collecting AT&T stock. Somebody had told her that she needed to, buy blue chip stock, and AT&T was big blue, so she put it together. And for years, she just bought the stock. Bessie died. She left them $4.5 million. It was clearly the confirmation of God on what they were doing. They didn't have to worry now about the building. They could make an even bigger building. And that's where the portrait of the crucifixion came from. They wanted to do something in memory of Bessie Burke. And they decided that that would be something she would really like. They hired an artist to come, and he was there for a year, and he painted the picture, and it got great publicity, and all kinds of people in the area knew about the church and the restaurant. The third thing they said was that they really needed to get a new pastor. This wasn't their language, but in the language of church growth, they needed someone with a different gift mix. They needed someone with the gift of administration, because this thing was really getting large, and somebody would be able to control the operation. And they did. They asked Mr. Getz to move, and they brought in a man who really understood all of this, knew how to run a large church, a vibrant operation. He was tuned in. He talked about the CD-ROM mission or ministry. It was a chicken dinner religious outreach mission. And the church, they cut the service on Sunday down to about half an hour, short devotion, some singing, praying for the rest of the day. They closed the restaurant on Tuesday. And on Tuesday, they had a service. They had teaching and singing, and, it was their time. And they would get, 400 or 500 people who would come. It was remarkably successful. And so, as a result, the Church of God in Christ chicken restaurant penetrated the community. That story is true. It's absolutely true. I changed the names of the people and the place, and there really wasn't a restaurant, but the story is true. It's true in the same way that a parable is true. And that story presents to you certain questions you have to answer. One question that you might want to wonder about is, did the church step over a line? And what line did it step over? Was it wrong to give the name of the church to a chicken restaurant? I mean, churches are giving their names to hospitals, to insurance companies, to bookstores, even to used clothing outlets. Why not a chicken restaurant? Or Was it wrong for them to really want to reach their community? Was it wrong for them to go down into Denver and to ask a firm to help them with this operation? Would it have been more Christian if the chicken had been burned, or biscuits had been hard, or the desserts flat? Someplace along the line, that church, in its eagerness to reach its culture and its community, seemed to have crossed the line. But the question is, so what line did it cross? That's something you're going to have to wrestle with. It is really a theological question. I think one thing we'd agree on, that when a church becomes a chicken restaurant, it's probably gone too far.